it's 11 o'clock and people are still joining us, but I am going to start us off. And I guess to start, I just want to thank other people. We should have probably about 10 more people, I think, joining us. But thank everybody for joining us. We are all obviously very concerned about Ukraine. If we can do it, we would wave our magic wand and stop this. But you know, this is anyway. War and violence as a way to try to solve people has been with us almost since the beginning. It has never worked, and so we're here to try to take steps in that positive way to get there. So I just want to make a couple of comments. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves when they start. We have two people with us who have done a lot of work over the years on Catholic nonviolence, and they're going to just be giving us some of their thoughts to start out the discussion. And then we will try to open it up to a discussion. We're going to go to about noon, and hopefully people, almost everybody has been on enough Zoom meetings the last 2 years that if you do want to make a comment, we're asking maybe that you hold your hand up on the, using the reaction thing like I have now with my hand. It's on mine, it's on the bottom right-hand side for anybody who hasn't been on too many Zoom meetings. So if you do want to do it, raise that hand, or you could just raise your own hand and we'll try to call on you. Try to, if you can, make your comments or questions as brief as possible, because we do want to end around noon. If there's a lot of interest, maybe we'll go a couple minutes later, but there's obviously a lot to say. So just try to keep your comments or questions as short as possible. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. I think, Dan, you're going to lead us off with just some observations on the topic. And if both of you, Dan and Marie, could introduce yourself to start out with, that would be good. So Dan Moriarty, please take it away.
Yeah, hi. I am Dan Moriarty. I work with the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns here in Washington, and counsel for Pax Christi Metro DC, Baltimore. I've just been in the area for 3 years this month. So I was in Bolivia before that, so I haven't met some of you. I was excited to see Frank DiBernardo here because we have not met yet, but you're one of my heroes. So we usually in the Maryknoll office work on issues relating to countries where Maryknoll missioners work, because we have stories and experiences to share with policymakers and things. But both because I'm also on the steering committee and an advocacy working group with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, Pax Christi International, and we've been looking at the Ukraine conflict as a kind of case study in how we can advocate for policies that advance nonviolence. And also because sometimes there are things like this that intersect with so many of the different issues that we work on that the Maryknoll office kind of drops everything. And so it's the last couple of weeks, I've been just kind of doing a deep dive on this issue to put together a statement for our office, which, I don't know if one of you has that you could share in the, I don't have it in front of me, but share in the chat. But the Maryknoll office put out a statement that I drafted and then preparing for a upcoming meeting of this advocacy working group with Pax Christi International. And so I've been preparing for different conversations and different things and reading a ton. And so then in preparing for this, I started looking at, okay, how can I summarize that? And it is not a neat summary. There's just so much to this conflict. So that's all kind of a way to say that this will be a bit of a hodgepodge, but hopefully give us just somewhat of an overview of.
Is this what you're thinking, Dan?
No, here, I can actually find
Got it now. Wow.
I put a link in the chat.
Oh, thanks. To the Maryknoll statement.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So we don't have to share this screen, but it's just that link for future reference, but it's just a statement that our office put out. But a lot of offices have put out statements, and I know some of you at least received the letter from Pax Christi International, which is also really they've done some really important stuff on this. So let me just go over this kind of overview of issues that we and the church are looking at and can or should be looking at with regard to this conflict, looking at it from different angles, and then we can have kind of a discussion of where, if there are places where we'd like to focus our energies. The first thing that's just emerging so tragically quickly is the humanitarian need. 1 million people displaced in a week. They're saying 1 million people displaced by this war. So working with them, which a lot of the European groups are doing, but there are also food shortages, water shortages, baby supplies are needed, and people are in metro platforms and things, and it's freezing in cold weather in Ukraine. So that work's being coordinated. Catholic Relief Services is working with Caritas Ukraine and European partners on a lot of that. So I don't know if anybody, as we go forward, might be able to speak to other opportunities to help out with that. But I know CRS is one place to start. Another thing that I think was shared was by email was the piece that John Rowan and Eli McCarthy wrote on just peace in the Ukraine conflict. What would a just peace approach look like? And there was also a kind of adaptation of that published in America Magazine. But just peace in general, the just peace ethic, and Eli has written a whole book about it, is it's kind of an ethical framework for thinking about how to translate nonviolence as a set of principles, a spirituality, a way of life, how to translate that into policies and connect, kind of bridge nonviolence, spirituality, principles, values into practical peace building. And so it includes a number of areas that we can think about in terms of Ukraine. Starting with just the rhetoric that we use. I've been very aware of this in everything from friends' social media posts to the president talking about it. And how we dehumanize the enemy. This could be talking about Putin as a crazy person, as a monster, which directly translates into people saying, well, you can't negotiate with a crazy person or a completely immoral person. And so that it impedes the possibility of dialogue and negotiations, but also that bleeds over into talking about Russians. When we talk about the ordinary Russian people, and this gets into policies like the sanctions and punishing them, making them suffer. And then the flip side of that is some of the positive things that can seem positive, but there's a lot of acts of solidarity right now with using the Ukraine flag, which I think is a shorthand for the Ukraine people and showing solidarity in a visual way that makes sense. But we need to be wary of how that bleeds over into nationalism and cheerleading for war. And so, and all of this, when we talk about rhetoric, is also related to the idea of integral disarmament, which is another piece of this. Integral disarmament means actual disarmament of militaries and but also an internal kind of disarmament. How do we use that logic? Pope Francis referred in a statement the other day to the diabolical and perverse logic of weapons. And he was talking about those who would make war, like Russia in this case. But our security strategies as a nation are also based on a logic of weapons, deterrence, threats, and our rhetoric as well speaks to that. The idea of the threats that have escalated throughout the buildup to this, even from the West as well as from Russia. Some of the things we can look at trying to, people are looking at trying to establish our ceasefire for negotiations. They did establish the other day an agreement about a humanitarian corridor in the conflict. To go along with that, people have talked about establishing Kiev as an open city, kind of a city where they wouldn't have warfare. That could be kind of in the context of limited ceasefires and things, but anyway, to interrupt the violence. So we're always looking to use tools, active tools of nonviolence, and establish peace long term. But another goal is always to interrupt violence where it's happening. Then there's opportunities for nonviolent action. So this could be supporting defectors and deserters from the Russian side. And also how we reach out, and this is something for a bigger conversation, to the protesters that we see in Russia, especially the peace protesters, and looking for ways to communicate creatively with them, because there is a real, Putin has now shut down social media. The Russian media is very much controlled, and there's a lot of misinformation and lack of information, despite all the signs we've seen of goodwill and anti-war sentiment there. And then there's also things happening in Ukraine, which I think don't get enough attention, but sabotage. They've stalled this convoy that was headed for Kiev by taking out bridges and things and stalling them on the highway. They've also attacked them militarily, but I think there are nonviolent, creative things that people are doing to resist the invasion. Misdirection. There's a whole campaign within Ukraine of changing street signs to confuse the invaders and get them lost and impede their strategic inroads there. Another thing that's important has been pretty lacking in our at least public statements from many of our leaders on the US side is recognizing the needs of the other. What does Russia want? What do they need? What are their concerns? And where there's legitimacy to some of those concerns. Now, there's a lot of confusion right now about what Putin actually wants and what he's actually planning. Nobody seems to know exactly what his end game is here. Observers in Russia, a lot of people seemed to be taken by surprise. They didn't think he would actually do this. So there is confusion, but he's given us a lot of signs. And I think, we go with what we have, and he's spoken to concerns about the Donbass region, which are mainly Russian there in the east, but also NATO expansion. So those are two major areas where there's room for negotiation. Looking at the idea of neutrality for Ukraine, of halting and maybe pulling back some of the NATO expansion, dialoguing about the future of NATO. That's changed over the years. It's gone back and forth to where Russia almost, and Putin himself almost treated NATO as a partner in certain moments, but clearly sees it also as a threat, and increasingly, again, as a threat. Looking at regional autonomy, there's always been a real resistance to that in Ukraine, and it could be something that can be negotiated for these regions in the east to decentralize a little bit the power within Ukraine. And then looking at where we keep our missiles, even in the established NATO states that they see as a threat. We have missiles very close to Russia in Europe, nuclear missiles. So, and then looking at past successful negotiations like the Minsk Accords that have basically been thrown out the window, you know, and they can talk about whose fault that is, but how to get back to those accords that everyone was able to agree on before. So, you know, I think there's just been a lot of government officials, talking heads, analysts who've been making the case against Russia and denying and obfuscating and attacking all of their claims and expressions of concern. And I think that's frustrating, but we can push our leaders to consider those in negotiations. Mediation. A lot of actors have offered to mediate, and each one has its own interesting relationship with the conflict, or with Russia, with Ukraine. Turkey was trying to establish themselves as a mediator. They also they sell a lot of drones to Ukraine, some of which have already been used in this conflict. So that's interesting. Israel has offered to mediate, and they have a fascinatingly complex relationship with Russia that's worth looking at. China has offered to mediate, and they are a major, their silence on this and their tacit to active support of Putin, I think plays a big role in empowering him to do what he's doing. So, but the other big potential mediator with a lot of historical precedents would be the Vatican, the Holy See. And so there's been talk of that. The Secretary of State has offered that, and there's been a lot of discussion inside and outside the church of the precedents, even of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the role that the Pope played in brokering negotiations there. And another issue to be looking at is gas and oil and the role that they play. I don't know if people saw it, but the Senate moved quickly on a bill to bipartisan bill the other day, and I don't think it's passed yet, but it's bicameral, not just the Senate, bicameral and bipartisan, to cut off all oil imports, oil and gas and fuel imports from Russia as part of the sanctions. And it was the press conference about it was, I mean, in some ways it makes sense, but in other ways, we really need to speak to the need to free ourselves from our dependence on fossil fuels, wherever they come from, so that we can merge seeking peace and ending dependence on a country like Russia with our climate goals, for example, because the two senators who spoke were Manchin and Murkowski, and they both were really talking up how we can do this because all we need to do, and we have the capacity to do it, is very quickly ramp up coal oil production in their states. And we can very quickly replace all of the oil that we now get from Russia. And so no problem. And at the end, somebody asked about climate, and Manchin said, well, of course, we also, you know, I've always supported building up our infrastructure for alternative fuels and addressing the climate concerns, but we need the horsepower to fuel our nation in the meantime. So you can't stop producing the fossil fuels until the other things are in place. Of course, he just stopped us from putting those things in place with the green infrastructure bill. So I don't know what he means about always supporting that, but I think we really need to be a voice for recognizing the role that European dependence and our dependence on Russian oil and gas plays in this conflict, but looking at the long-term goal of ending dependence on those fuels everywhere. Another big question, two big questions then are nuclear, the nuclear issue within this conflict. Three issues: the nuclear issue, sanctions, and the question of a no-fly zone and the role of NATO. Sanctions, people seem to agree on them, and they seem to be presented here as fairly as nonviolent. There are some legitimate arguments that Russians need to stand up to their leadership, and so perhaps this will create discontent in Russia, but there is language about punishing the Russian people, and there is a logic that policymakers in the US have expressed that we will create suffering among ordinary Russians with these sanctions, and that will create discontent, which will lead them to rise up and create regime change. This never works. The one example people always give is South Africa. That was a completely different situation where we had the support of people on the ground in South Africa. The people who were being hurt were asking for sanctions that would impact them because the apartheid regime was impacting them more. And so it was an internal conflict, not an international conflict. It was a very different situation. But when you look at Iraq and so many other places where we've tried this approach, what it does is A, it's immoral because it hurts civilians, and B, it more generally tends to create resentment of the people imposing the sanctions. And so people rally around leaders that they otherwise would not have supported. You see this in Iran as well. And so I think we really need to look at how we talk about these sanctions. And one thing is we've just been preparing people for I think politically our leaders don't want people to expect them to work overnight because they know they won't. And so they've been talking about them being long-term and how much they're going to punish and the Russians. What they're not talking about is off-roads, off-ramps for the Russians, carrots, incentives for the Russians, how they get this, what they need to do to get those sanctions lifted. And without that, what are the sanctions actually achieving? The sanctions are effective when they are multilateral, which they are in this case, but also short-term with clear incentives for good behavior. It has to be a carrot and stick approach, and targeted so that they don't hurt civilians. So we're missing some key pieces to both effective and moral sanctions here. So we need to be watching. And at the very least, I think a lot of people aren't sure what the impact will be on ordinary Russians because it's a superpower, and we've usually used these against small, poorer countries. But we need to, at the very minimum, be monitoring the impact on ordinary Russians. The nuclear issue is huge here, and I think this could, in some ways, bring about a new sense of urgency that we've been kind of, a voice in the desert on this issue. And now I think people are aware of it again, that there really is this threat. It sounds like the board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist is having kind of an emergency meeting this week. And they announced it in terms of having recently kept the doomsday clock that they run set at 100 seconds to midnight, which that's the third year in a row, and it's the closest it's ever been to midnight. I think I get the feeling they're looking at moving it even closer in light of this. They usually do it once a year, but I think they might have an emergency announcement on that. So there are concrete things we can do around that. We could push for a no first use. the Biden administration is working on their nuclear posture review right now. And we've been told by people inside that process that one of the things that has not been decided yet, and that Biden has insisted on keeping kind of an open question for consideration, is whether to declare a policy of no first use. So that would really be a pressure on, and it's important to remember, it's kind of a strange thing, but negotiations happen even while hostilities happen. And we have been negotiating on these issues with Russia successfully. So in November, for the first time in a long time, we had the Russians and the US, Biden and Putin, reiterate what Gorbachev and Reagan had said, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. They came out with that joint statement in November. Then the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, nuclear powers, together reiterated it again in a statement in January. So there is a dialogue there to build on in terms of how our declaring no first use could impact Russia, both in not feeling like they need to use their deterrence, maybe helping them relax a little bit, but also hopefully ultimately declaring a no first use policy of their own. Sole authority is another thing. The presidents in both countries have the ability to launch a nuclear attack, and people are not at all confident anymore in what Putin might or might not do because they didn't expect him to invade. So I think that brings the idea of sole authority back into the spotlight. And then the idea of deterrence and how that diabolical logic of weapons that Pope Francis talked about is the driving force in our whole nuclear policy here. So I think nuclear non-proliferation is going to be much more difficult now because they brought this up in multiple meetings that Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world after the USSR split up, and they gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for promises of territorial integrity and security from the US and the Soviets and Europe. And now one of those parties has invaded them because they don't have nuclear weapons, but we're not getting involved. We're not enforcing a no-fly zone or anything because we know that would be dangerous because it would be us and the Russians, and we do have nuclear weapons. So the message there for Iran, for North Korea, for any other country is people will get mad at you if you try to have nuclear weapons, but it'll keep you a lot safer than not having them kept Ukraine. So it's going to make it a lot harder to work on non-proliferation. And it's important to keep in mind the context that the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference at the United Nations is happening in August of this year. And that I mentioned the no-fly zone question. Every meeting I've been in with Ukrainians over the last week, including church people, peace scholars, everyone is begging for a no-fly zone, close the skies. That's what I keep hearing from Ukrainians. And the West is resisting, NATO members are resisting doing that because of escalation. I have not heard a single Ukrainian really outline why they think that's not a risk. I think there is a tension right now. And I think this is really, to me, where the rubber hits the road for those of us who would promote nonviolence. We have all of these tools for nonviolence. A good number of them are long-term tools, but when people are most likely to set aside the idea of nonviolence is when they are being attacked in the moment and do not see a nonviolent way of stopping it, and they are desperate to make it stop. And so I think that the concerns of the West are legitimate, that a no-fly zone, we don't know that Putin would respect it. It would definitely make him feel more threatened by the West. And if he violated it, it would mean NATO powers shooting Russian airplanes out of the sky. And that would escalate the conflict. It would bring us into direct conflict with the Russians, and it could lead to escalation toward nuclear war. That's a real concern. But hearing Ukrainians cry out for this and not having anything else to offer that will stop the raining down of bombs, we need to be able to speak to them too and recognize the situation they're in. So it's a challenge for us. And so the other thing that I think we need to be looking at is the relationship with the churches in Russia. That's really complicated. What, Marie, were you?
No, go ahead.
Oh, it's so complicated. The relationship between different factions of the Orthodox Church. There are two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, one that is independent and one that is in communion with Moscow. And then there is the division emerging now in this conflict between the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine and in Russia. And then within Russia, there has been an increasing call from clergy and for the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, to speak out against the war. He has not. He's been supportive of Putin, but it's unprecedented for the clergy to be speaking out against this. The bishops, even in the Orthodox leaders of the Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, have spoken out against the war. And then obviously the independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been against the war. And I think this has a huge impact on what Pope Francis is willing to do and how he's handling this in terms of being a mediator, in terms of speaking out, in terms of, there was a call by the Catholic Church in Ukraine for him to intervene directly and come to Ukraine before the invasion. And he hasn't done that because I think he's looking at what his ability to impact he's been having all this ecumenical dialogue with Kirill and with the Orthodox Church, and how he can bring that into play and influence the Orthodox Church. So I assume, and Marie may have more insights into this, but that there's probably a lot of behind the scenes activity between the Vatican and the Orthodox Church right now that may speak to why we haven't seen as much action publicly from the Vatican as some people would like on this issue. So what can we do? Statements, advocacy. I think we can focus our efforts in two ways: on policymakers and within the church. We can look at communicating with the Vatican, which Marie can speak about, with our own bishops, which we talked a little bit about earlier on the nuclear issue in our council meeting. But I think on this too, asking them to speak out in different ways, and then look for ways, this is a challenge that I don't know how to do, but to communicate with Orthodox clergy and laity on the ground, especially in Russia, and encourage them, and how to find those channels of communications is a challenge. And then all the things I talked about in terms of just peace and nonviolent approaches and rhetoric, we can look for ways to put pressure on our own policymakers. So in general, we need to look beyond waging or even winning war to the idea of building peace. We need to think short-term and long-term. We need to look at interrupting violence, transforming conflict, and ultimately doing so in a way that leads to a reconciliation process. And so everything we do should be with an eye toward sustainable peace. I think it sounds trite or obvious to say we should be looking at peace, not war. But I think that how to do that and be aware of how all the pieces lead towards the sustainable peace is complicated. And so that's what I've tried to lay out a little bit here. So like I warned you, it would be a hodgepodge. But Marie, you may have a way to focus some of that more helpfully.
Well, Dan, I'll just
I
jump.
wasn't able to follow the chat while I was talking, so I'll look at that while Marie's talking.
I'll just jump in real quick before Marie starts. Thanks, Dan. That was great. And we'll, after Marie speaks, we will have a discussion. Frank had his hand up, so Frank's going to be one of our first people. So let us know if you want to talk. Marie, please.
Sure. I'm Marie Dennis, and I am. I have worked with Pax Christi for the last 15 years with Pax Christi International. I'm a senior advisor to the Secretary General and program chair for the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which has been my main work for quite a few years. It's great to be with you all again. And Dan covered the waterfront, so I don't have a lot to add. I think it's more important for us to have a good conversation. I'll just maybe make a couple of points. One is that because of the work that we've been doing with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, the objective of which, or the purpose of which, is to try to move nonviolence to the center of Catholic thinking and teaching in response to violences of every kind, including the violence of war. Because of the work that we've been doing there, we have built some quite helpful relationships and channels into the Vatican. So Pax Christi International, as the situation in Ukraine began to heat up, we were asked by a number of organizations and did, in fact, send a letter from our leadership, our co-presidency and Secretary General to Pope Francis, urging him, as Dan said, to be personally involved, recalling the experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis of the effectiveness of the Vatican. We have had some ongoing conversation about that. We did hear from Pope Francis that he had read the letter, and that was somewhat encouraging. We've gotten a couple of side messages. One, that there is an ongoing conversation that is not public and probably won't be public between especially the Secretary of State and sort of through diplomatic channels. Dan and I were both part of a conversation yesterday. Some of you may have been also with leaders in the Ukrainian church that emphasized the importance of the role, as Dan said, that Patriarch Kirill from the Russian Orthodox Church can play because of the very particular relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin and the Russian government that has been very long-standing. There has always been a very challenging, delicate way of communicating between the Vatican and the Russian Orthodox Church. It was so delicate that for many years, Pax Christi International actually participated in an ongoing dialogue with Russian Orthodox leaders because the Vatican could not, and asked Pax Christi International to do that. We do have members in Russia. We have members in all of Eastern Europe. We know that there is a lot of work going on. We don't know exactly what it is. We did get a sort of sideways push from the Dicastery for Integral Human Development to try to get the US bishops to be fully engaged and pushing in the right direction. So we'll see. What I think is the one opportunity that I think is significant and hopeful. I don't know how it will play out now, but we've had some very specific interest from the Vatican in understanding the just peace framework that Dan was talking about, how to apply that in this situation. and in other situations, which is encouraging. And I think the challenge before all of us right now is to try to understand how the just peace framework applies in a situation of active war, as such as is happening in Ukraine. And I think there's some really good work being done in thinking through that. Eli McCarthy has continued to do some really helpful thinking and writing about it. I think that maybe just a couple of things about that. One is that in the situation that we're in right now, I believe that it is most helpful if we emphasize the conversation about nonviolence and just peace rather than our opposition to the just war framework and to every possible imaginable kind of violence, because we're in a situation. What do we do now? There has to be people. Number one, people in the context of Ukraine need to be able to make moral and ethical decisions for themselves. It's not up to us to say, you have no right to defend yourselves with arms because we believe in nonviolence. I think our job is to articulate the effectiveness of nonviolence, which the Ukrainians, as you can see very well, know very well, better than we do, the effectiveness of nonviolent action. And I think we need to find ways to support that without in any way criticizing their decision, very understandable decision to protect themselves with arms. I think that from my perspective right now, one of the most important things that we can do is to contribute to and to stimulate a moral imagination about how nonviolence works and how it can be effective in protecting people, at lifting up in every possible way what Ukrainians are already doing, what has been effective in other parts of the world in situations of extreme violence, how external players can support nonviolent action. To me, that is what's most hopeful about the fact that a lot of stories about nonviolent resistance and all the way nonviolent action, all the way from diplomacy to active, courageous civil resistance. I shared a video this morning that I'm sure you have all seen of, in one version or another, of the Ukrainians physically standing in the way of Russian military vehicles trying to move forward. Phenomenal. We need to lift up those stories. We need to tweet them and retweet them and circulate them and explain why they're important, show that they are not utopian foolishness, but truly effective. So I think that's one thing we need to do. The second thing that we need to do is to keep our focus on the long-term lessons that we're learning and the importance of bringing those into practice starting right now. All of the questions about that are part of the Just Peace framework about training in skills for nonviolent action, learning and sharing a set of values that move us in that direction, questions of disarmament. And so I think one of the long-term dangers right now was voiced by the German chancellor the other day, who raised the German military expenditures in very significant ways. I think a big worry is that is exactly what's going to happen everywhere, that it will be a justification for for the US military budget to be raised and for all of the European countries to raise their military budgets. I think that's a really big concern. And then I think a huge challenge is to use the, if you will, both the dangerous but miraculous tools of new technologies, of social media and communications tools and so on, to help open the space for civil society in Russia and in Ukraine to do what they are already doing. And so any ways that we can support or encourage surrounding countries or our own country to support facilitating channels of both WhatsApp and platform and other new technologies that people, our board member who lives in St. Petersburg will not communicate by anything except platform or WhatsApp right now. I think we need to be encouraging countries around Ukraine and elsewhere to offer immediate asylum, sanctuary to any Russian soldiers that would desert, and help them find ways to get to safety, and so on. And I think we need to connect nuclear disarmament with a commitment to nonviolence. That I think we are also moving into, on the one hand, as Dan said, this could be an opportunity to, it will make the danger of nuclear weapons and of nuclear energy as more visible. At the same time, my guess is that it could be an impetus to the development of more tactical nuclear weapons, lower yield weapons that could in fact be used. And I think we need to be sort of watching these long-term channels. So I'm going to stop there because I think that your conversation is really what's most important. And Dan really covered I think the role of the churches, of the complexity of the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, the potential role of the Russian Orthodox patriarch in pulling Putin back from this folly, and the potential role of the Vatican encouraging that, I think, are important pieces to just add to what Dan already said. So I'm going to stop there and invite your comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Marie and Dan. You really gave us a lot to think about and to ponder. So before we get into the question and answer period, I want to encourage anybody who hasn't, look at the chat. There's been a number of good things posted on the chat, but let's dive right in. And Frank, you had a question. If you could raise your question.
Thank you, Bob. And really, all I could say is, wow. For the last 2 weeks, I've been watching this story and listening to it on the news, and just feeling so helpless in terms of nonviolent response. And both of you really did such an excellent job. I have a question and then a little comment. My question is for Dan. You mentioned no-fly zones. Earlier this week, I was listening to NPR, and they had the former Supreme Commander of NATO on, and he said that no-fly zones were an act of war. He said because in order to have a no-fly zone, you have to back it up with shooting down planes. He did say there's such a thing as a humanitarian no-fly zone, and a call came in on my cell phone just as he was about to explain what that meant. So I never got the definition. So I'm wondering what you would say about whether no-fly zones are an act of war, and is there such a thing as humanitarian no-fly zones? And before you answer, I just want to make my comment.
Frank, you're muted. Okay, you're
Just when you were about to start your comment.
Oh, okay. I put into the chat right now, I'm a member of Pax Christi USA's anti-racism team. And for information, we put out a statement yesterday on the website about the racist dimensions of this war. So.
Thank you for that. I want to look at that. And I know, I wish I'd been on the call the whole time, but there was a call yesterday about women's role in peace building here and things. But apparently one of the women on the call was basically looking at the role, speaking to the role of women and a lot of important things, and then also defending the racist policies in terms of who's being excluded from fleeing the country and stopped at the borders and things like that, and some of the racism in Ukraine. And so I want to go back and find out what that was all about, because that's how I heard it described, and I haven't heard her comments yet, but it's an issue that's not getting a lot of attention in this conflict. So thanks for that. With the no-fly zones, yeah, they are an act of war. And I think Biden is very much aware of this because and that you have to back it up, because the Obama administration took so much heat from the Republicans and it was such a sort of blunder. Pretty similar situation in Syria, where they drew the red line and then didn't enforce it, partly because of Russia's involvement and not wanting to get into a shooting war with Russia there. And so yeah, you have to enforce it generally. Now, I think what they mean by humanitarian, I'm not an expert on this, but I think humanitarian no-fly zones would be the kinds of things that we already have success. Yesterday, it's the humanitarian corridor. That would mean that you're allowing humanitarian aid into the country, which would mean not bombing it. And this idea that's been raised but not negotiated yet of naming certain places like the capital, basically a non-combat zone. And so I think I don't know the ins and outs and haven't been able to find too much information. Just time-wise, it may be out there, but on how the negotiations have gone, I know early on when they talked about broad negotiations, the Ukrainians said there needs to be a ceasefire first, and there hasn't been. But then they were having negotiations, so I don't know if they just saw an opportunity and realized they had to take it, even though they hadn't achieved a ceasefire in order to have those negotiations. But they have had 2 rounds of negotiations with the Russians in the midst of all this violence. That's something I think people forget sometimes when we talk about negotiations. They think, how can you negotiate? There's negotiations happening between Ukrainians and Russians in the midst of this war fighting. They are also talking. And you need to look at those as opportunities to build on. And they did establish this idea. And now I don't know if it's started to be implemented yet, but this humanitarian corridor that they agreed upon. So there could be a 3rd round where they look at widening that in terms of humanitarian no-fly zone. So that would be something the Russians would agree to in negotiations. But announcing to closing the skies, as the Ukrainians have been calling for, would be more it is an act of war, especially when the world, the United Nations, the Security Council, that everybody, was against this invasion, and they invaded anyway. So there is no strong reason to believe that if we announced a no-fly zone, it wouldn't be violated. I think it's pretty likely that it would quickly involve actually shooting down planes. And if it didn't, then anything else that we did, we would have no credibility. So it's, that's it. I think it is an act of war. I mean, it's a threat. It sounds defensive. I mean, it's defensive, but it's a threat. It's saying, now if you keep doing what you're doing, we'll kill you for it. So that's an act of war.
Thanks, Dan. Dennis, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, it's clear the lines between violence and nonviolence are not very clear, and they're actually, they seem to be flexible depending on who's arguing the case. If a no-fly zone is considered an act of war, which I believe it is, what about things which allow the contending parties to continue to fight longer? For instance, providing humanitarian relief to one or more of the contestants gives them the ability to continue to struggle. Phyllis Bennis, for instance, has said that sanctions are an act of war. So one can look at nonviolence from a very pure standpoint, which is completely unrealistic, and it wouldn't work in a real world in which no actions are taken, in which someone is injured in the process, as opposed to a more realistic sense where you're against the violence, but there are levels of violence that you must undertake in order to stop the violence sooner or reduce the violence in its intensity.
I guess I just would like to pick up on that a little bit, Dennis. Thank you. I think that it also points to the need for all of us to understand violence better, and to understand that if nonviolence is a rejection of violence and the commitment to new ways of being in relationship with each other, I think it becomes really important for us to understand the complexity of violence and the many faces of violence and the many levels of violence. And I'm not sure we do a very good job of that. I think that sanctions are an example. One, I mean, I think that the use of sanctions is another sort of, and I think you and Dan were both talking about this, but it seems to me that sanctions are also very complex, that there are all kinds of sanctions, and that so separating those out and figuring, are there nonviolent sanctions? Are there less violent sanctions? Where is there a white line in the application of sanctions beyond which we would say we will not go there because it is a deep expression of violence?
Thanks, Marie. Kurt?
Yeah, thanks. Great, lots of very thought-provoking stuff. And I especially like that kind of where violence is. Because I think one thing that makes it hard to stick, I know, just feeling myself, hard to stick to my nonviolence is and also what's hard for people to choose it, is it saying, in this instance, if I were in Ukraine, what can I do, or what can we do to really stop this? And I know you've talked about it, how we let them make their choice, and the wonderful examples of all the nonviolent things that Ukrainians have done. But what I think in order to actually, for other people to choose nonviolence, we have to, in this instance, really, what can we do to stop the violence quickly? And I think most of the things that have been proposed won't do it. Even though the Russian church, what you said about the Russian church, I think, wow, that's a really good insight. Another thing is, we haven't really talked about, yeah, it's the leaders who make the choice, but it's the soldiers who fire the guns. And I think the examples that Ukrainians have shown, like in standing in front of tanks and other things, and they're offering money to soldiers who give up. I don't know I haven't heard about how effective that is, but maybe focusing on the humanity of the Russian soldiers and speaking directly to them. Is there anything that is, I mean, does that really work?
Mhm.
Is that something how could we help that to happen?
Thanks, Kurt. And I'm just going to interrupt quickly, and hopefully somebody will respond to your comments, but it is 12 o'clock. Hopefully we can go on for a few minutes more, but we won't be going on, too much longer. But if you feel that you need to leave, please leave. If you want to stay, please stay with us. So does anybody want to respond to Kurt, and then we'll have Jeanette make her comment.
I would like to just really briefly, because just to say, yes, there is certainly experience of situations in which inviting the defection of soldiers has been effective. The most obvious is in the people power movement in the Philippines in the 1980s. It was a deliberate strategy on the part of the organized civil resistance, and it was really effective. And I think that points, from my perspective, that points to a role that we can play, and that the institutional church, which I'm trying to push, could play, which is to encourage the training of all of us in nonviolent tools, in learning what are the strategies, and then in organizing as violence. I think even now it's pretty clear that the people of Ukraine are doing some phenomenal organizing and thinking and training and strategizing. So yes, it can be effective. So it's certainly worth a try.
Thanks. Jeanette?
So I think what I would like to have heard more of in this discussion is a distinction between the interests of Russia and the interests of Putin. I've heard, talking about, well, the Russians want this and the Ukrainians want that. And I don't think that's where the problem lies. I think the problem lies with what Putin wants, which is not necessarily in the interests of Russia, but in the interests of Putin. And when you take an actor who has so much power at his fingertips, nuclear, financial, anything, and he can turn it against his own people, and he's behaving very irrationally, more so it seems as time goes on. I just have a hard time seeing how all of these nonviolent approaches are even feasible in a situation like this. I mean, so I think there's a danger in conflating Putin's interests with Russia's interests.
I think that's a great point, Jeanette. Although I do think that in Russia, the nonviolent civil resistance is incredibly brave and impressive, and that yes, part of the challenge is to make that more visible and to find ways to support the Russian people, who clearly there is a tremendous resistance to what Putin is doing. And so how to imagine supporting that, I think, is really key. And I think it may be the one thing that actually can stop Putin. And we don't know yet what that will look like, but your separation of Putin from the interests of Russia is absolutely right.
So, one of the things I just like to add at this point too is that, this is a long journey. We know how to, we think we know how to stop wars by more violence, but we are learning that that is not the case. But people around the world are still at a kindergarten level, in my estimation, of knowing how to do nonviolent stuff. And hopefully at some point, like just in the United States, if we end up, hopefully we don't get into this situation, but if we end up going into a new war, if we did have 1 million people in the United States who were willing to be out in the streets, get arrested, and keep on doing this, we could. I think as low a number as that, and Dan or Marie may have some other ideas about that. As low a number of that, we could really stop the government, call the government to stop. And that's what we have to do. We have to be able to really teach and train people all around the world about nonviolence. Otherwise, the Putins of the world are going to continue winning. Other comments, questions anybody have?
Yeah, I have a question of Dan. I know you brought up the Minsk Accords. I have not been able to find out much about what that was or what the outcome was. Do you have more information on that?
I can look. I mean, they're complicated, and but there's. I can look up. I can try to find a good overview and send them.
Okay, that would be good. Jerry?
Yeah.
I mean, the opportunity this is to like produce or find somebody to produce media that really highlights all of the nonviolent successes that we can assemble to encourage the people. I think it's a moral imagination that Marie talked about.
Yeah.
How can we get more and more videographic examples of successes?
And just to highlight that, I think when you do a survey of the news, they always do breaking news, and there's 5 violent stories of gun violence, and cry out that we can't have this anymore. What if we had 5 breaking news of how all ages disarmed or changed the course of something that could have escalated by disarming? And I totally agree with Bob and Marie that I think you're saying that we are at a low level, and all of us have been advocating that this is such a crisis, just like the pandemic. We all need to escalate the peace education to the highest, or we're going to fall and perish like fools, which King told us ages ago. I think this is our golden opportunity, and I totally agree that the stories and the faces of the Ukrainians, which I need to just bring more and bring into the classroom as I hear kids and college students just grieving and pummeling down of depression. So I think there's so many levels here. Anyway, thank you.
Dan and Marie, do you know if the Orthodox Peace Fellowship of North America has been involved in any form or fashion with some of these talks between the Russian Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, etc.?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, and I unfortunately, the founder and secretary general of the Orthodox Peace Fellowship was Jim Forrest, who died just a few weeks ago. And the only new things on their website are tributes to Jim. Everything they have on Ukraine is from 2014.
Yeah. The staff person who was the head of the North American Fellowship, he lived in Columbia, Maryland. In fact, Mary Leopold and I drove up with him a number of years ago up to New York, and I'm forgetting his name, but yeah, we should try to, I don't know if he's still active or not, but again, that's another possible way for us to get more and more.
Just one thing I would say, and it kind of gets to what MJ was talking about, that we need to hold up these examples, promote these examples of nonviolence working throughout this, through media, articles, op-eds, encouraging getting that narrative, because it's also the first writing of history, and we want an accurate history of how this is all resolved, how nonviolence works within a conflict that people don't always see, but it's usually there. And I think one thing to keep in mind and keep reminding people is that it takes time, as does everything. And I think there's a strange thing that I've just observed again and again in conflicts like this, where people get upset that because they feel like people promoting nonviolence are not responding to the urgency of the situation. And the implication is that violence will work more quickly. Does not either. And so there's something about nonviolent approaches that feels like they are too slow and too soft, whereas violence feels immediate. But violent acts are immediate acts that spawn more violence and chaos in a situation. So a good example of this, there was a pretty horrifying but really telling interview Rachel Maddow did a couple days ago with Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton held up as the model, and I'm not joking, you can look it up and read the transcript. The model to look to here was Afghanistan in the 80s, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, that by arming insurgents and empowering them to fight, tiny Afghanistan was able to get rid of the Soviet Union. And then she said, and there were some unintended consequences that we all know. And then she just moved past that. But the fact that the best model, I mean, she brought this up, but nobody asked her about Afghanistan. So this is a Secretary of State going to talk specifically about this. And the example she brought to the interview was Afghanistan as a model to look to, of this idea that the answer here is to fight, win, and defeat Russia rather than to look toward ways to build a peace with Russia. And even by the short-term success, even if you let her paper over the unintended consequences of, 30, 40 years of war in Afghanistan, with or without the Soviets, it took them 9 years to get rid of the Soviets. So even if none of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and everything had happened, it took 9 years to get rid of the Soviets that way. So there's a lot we can do non-violently in 9 years if we're looking at, if the model suggests, a 5 to 10 year plan of war for the Ukrainians. So it frustrates me then when you suggest nonviolent models that people reject them because they're not going to work by tomorrow. We haven't gotten negotiations yet, so clearly you can't negotiate with Putin because he's rejected some offers. They take a long time. Violence takes even longer. And I don't know why people don't see that, but it's worth. So I guess my give peace a chance. But time-wise, that's just something I've never understood, that people seem to think violence is quick and effective, and that our only opposition to it is that we keep our hands clean morally.
Okay, folks, it's almost 12:15, and unless Russ Testa has the final word of how to resolve all this that he wants to give, I think we'll call it a day in a second or two. What we'll try to do, we want to thank everybody else who usually doesn't join us on Saturday mornings to think about joining us in one way or the other in the future, because we need more and more people to try to build on nonviolence. We have $700 billion to the Pentagon every year for violent ways of dealing with this stuff, which hasn't worked. And we basically have no money going to nonviolence, but if we can work on that, I think we'll be in good shape. So, again,
Bob,
yeah, and
yeah,
but
the
one second.
person you're,
Wait a second, Tony, 1 second. And then just before we leave, we'll also try to send out to some of the people who are joining us, some of the different documents that have been noted to us. So go ahead, Tony, you last.
okay, no problem. The person you were trying to remember the name of from Columbia was Alex Patico. He was a member of the board of MEPJ. He was a real dynamo, but he's had to step back due to health issues. He's still around, but
Okay.
no, he's not very involved anymore.
Yeah, I didn't think it was, but thank you. Yeah, Alex is the one I was referring to. Okay, everyone, it's a terrible situation. We've got to keep on praying and acting. And I got a lot of new good things that I hadn't thought of before to try to get involved with. So hopefully we all did and could try to do some things. Okay, have a good weekend, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining.